Welcome to the Patriotic Pulpit. One of the most interesting, if not at the same time fascinating and yet ominous stories to come out this last week involves the Scottish author J.K. Rowling. Scotland passed recently a hate crimes or a hate speech bill that banned certain kinds of hate speech, which we'll talk about in a few moments. And J.K. Rowling pushed back against it publicly, stood up for freedom, and really interesting things took place regarding it. So let's just back up for a moment and talk about J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling, of course, the author of the famous series Harry Potter books, she was recently entangled, that is maybe 6 to 8 months ago, entangled with defenders of transgenderism, at the same time defenders of Mormonism. Mormonism, transgenders kind of united together against J.K. Rowling because she pointed out, even though she defended the rights of transgender persons and she respected their dignity, she pointed out that people are not born transgender, or one cannot change that gender that he was born or she was born with at birth. You can't change the gender. That is a biological fact, and J.K. Rowling rightly pointed this out to a society in Scotland and in America apparently too that absolutely denies reality. And she likened the changing of one's gender to the Book of Mormon, or the golden plates that Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, supposedly saw. And she said the witnesses, of course, never saw the golden plates, and it's just all, of course, his own imagination. And that's what she likened transgenderism to. Well, the Mormons got all upset about it, and so did the transgenders, but J.K. Rowling is exactly right. Just speaking about Mormonism for a moment, neither did David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, the 3 witnesses who supposedly saw the golden plates that Joseph Smith found in New York, and supposedly he had translated these golden plates by putting a peepstone in his hat and is able to see one letter at a time and then dictating them to one of his companions. None of them ever saw those golden plates. Now, they claimed that they did, but it was all a big scam, and they later claimed that they did not see them. One of them claimed that he saw them only in spiritual form. In other words, there was no reality to them, and J.K. Rowling was exactly right to point out the scam of Mormonism and the scam of transgenderism. Well, now J.K. Rowling has come out again in the news regarding the hate speech law that was recently passed in Scotland. Now, as I pointed out, I'm not a Harry Potter fan. I'm not interested in defending the Harry Potter creations or her political feminist stance. However, she stands firmly for freedom of speech against the government in her native Scotland. But this has not only to do with Scotland. This has to do with freedom across the world, because we have the same thing going on in America, even though it has not been encoded into law. In American law, it is encoded into the United Nations, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And we have signed on to the United Nations, so we'll think about all of that for just a few moments. So this is what took place in Scotland. Monday, April 1st, April Fool's Day, the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill took effect in Scotland, which adds a new crime to Scottish books defined as stirring up hatred against protected groups, one of which is transgender identity. Rowling brought some of the only rational thought, I might add, to the public debate. But be that as it may, she made this comment regarding it. In passing the Scottish Hate Crime Act, Scottish lawmakers seem to have placed higher value on the feelings of men, performing their idea of femaleness, however misogynistically or opportunistically, than on the rights and freedom of actual women and girls. In other words, they're placing more protective custody around the feelings of men who are pretending to be women than they are really protecting women. She goes on to say, for several years now, Scottish women have been pressured by their government and members of the police force to deny the evidence of their eyes and ears, repudiate biological facts, and embrace a neo-religious concept of gender that is unprovable and untestable. The redefinition of woman to include every man, she continues, who declares himself to be one has already had serious consequences for women's and girls' rights and safety in Scotland. And then here's the highlighted, or the line that I think should be highlighted in your mind, and that is, freedom of speech and belief are at an end in Scotland if the accurate description of biological sex is deemed criminal. I thought, boy, she is a great author. She worded that exactly as it is, as reality shows us. Freedom of speech and belief are at an end in Scotland if the accurate description of biological sex is deemed criminal. And that, of course, goes not only for Scotland, but it goes for the United States as well. Now, I want to mention several things pertaining to this and what J.K. Rowling had to say, as well as just broaden out the thought moment regarding freedom of speech and our own Constitution, the danger that we're facing. What were some of the things behind that Scottish law? That will be interesting to look at. So let's notice some of those things. Number one, there are many reasons to reject hate speech as a category needing punishment. Most of all, to single out speech that supposedly incites criminal behavior is to curtail speech, period. Our own Constitution put this out of the realm of the federal government in the First Amendment. But that has not stopped totalitarian Joe and the totalitarian-minded Democrats from curtailing free speech on the internet. As everyone now knows, that's exactly what the Democrat, aka Communist Party in America, is all about, curtailing your freedom of speech. Let's talk about the Constitution for just a moment. The reason that in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution, we have Amendment number 1, the freedom of speech inclusive of freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, peaceable assembly, all of those freedoms are included in one amendment, that is the first, is important for us to recognize for two different reasons. Number one, the Bill of Rights listed specifically prohibitions against the federal government. The top of the list includes, of course, as mentioned, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. That is a unique feature of the Bill of Rights. It forbade and continues to forbid the federal government from having anything to do with freedom of religion, freedom of speech, anything at all to do. Now, that doesn't stop, of course, the totalitarian-minded Democrats who always, of course, communistic-minded, and they want to curtail everyone's speech. And so Joe Biden has operated through big tech, and the government itself, the Congress, has given big tech protective custody so that they may not be sued. And that, of course, is held over big tech and Twitter, Facebook, and all of those sites. It's that protective custody is held over them as an incentive to continue on the track, lining up with the Biden administration who says, here's what I want on the internet, here's what I don't want. Here's what I want on Twitter, here's what cannot be said. Here's what can be said on Facebook, here's what cannot be said. Who's doing that? The federal government. The Bill of Rights, however, put out of bounds to the federal government anything having to do with that. No federal officer may be involved in it. So the Bill of Rights is a specific list of prohibitions against the federal government. Now, the second unique feature of the Bill of Rights is that the founders did not wish the federal government to be the watchdog over the state's responsibility to protect the rights of people. That is simply to say that it's a state responsibility to oversee anything regarding freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Now, why did the founders not want the federal government to be the watchdog over the states? Because they believed in state sovereignty. That's why they did not want the federal government. They didn't want any law, if possible, to gravitate to a highest echelon of authority. Why? Because there would be no redress for the citizens of people. So the states were to oversee that. But of course, all of that is long lost, long gone. The Constitution is forgotten. The Constitution is simply birdcage liners, I put it before. So those are the two things regarding the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. So note specifically, it forbade the federal government from having anything to do with freedom of speech. And number two, the federal government was not to be the watchdog over the states. Now, secondly, and then we'll take a break, we'll come back with some other material that's pretty interesting after this. But the second thing that I want you to notice regarding hate speech laws, such as is taking place in Scotland right now, in which J.K. Rowling pointed out, of course, is this the utmost hypocrisy, is that what is hateful to one person is not necessarily hateful to another. Hate, like beauty, is in the eye, or in this case, the ear of the beholder. And under particular assault is the preaching against various sins that plague society. For example, the Christian Institute writes this: conduct need not be threatening or even intended to stir up hatred for an offense to be committed. Instead, the bill, that is in Scotland, captures any abusive behavior deemed likely to stir up hatred. An offense could even be unwittingly committed in the privacy of your own home. And there's not nearly enough protection of free speech. J.K. Rowling called this out. She said, you know what? I'm out of the country now. I'm coming back to the country, and I invite you to come arrest me because I say this bill is wrong. I'm speaking out against the government. So the Christian Institute continues, and I want you to note carefully what this involves. Many who oppose biblical truth and biblical truth claims, many of those tell us that disagreeing with them amounts to hatred. The proposed stirring up of hatred offenses would give people that are hostile to Christianity a new tool to try to close down debate and silence Christians. That's exactly what's taking place. They want the pulpits to shut up, put a gag in your mouth, just as Lyndon Johnson tried to do in the United States, and our own federal government tries to do by telling all churches, here's what you can and cannot say in election time, here's what you cannot say in tax season time. This is exactly what this bill is designed to do, to shut up the people who are should be the moral standards reflecting the Bible in society. So what about preachers and teachers who speak about the sin of homosexuality? What about preachers and teachers such as myself who speak out about those sins of sodomy, the sins of transgenderism, the sin of adultery, the sins of other sexual sins? What about those who try to educate the public regarding the false teacher Muhammad? How about the false book that his followers produced, that is the Quran? How about preachers who want to point out the wrongness, the deception of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, or of Buddha? You see, all of this criticism and all of this open debate and discussion comes to a screeching halt in Scotland. And that's exactly what they want to take place right here in America also. We'll be back in just a moment. We're talking about J.K. Rowling, the hate speech law that was recently passed in Scotland, and what appears to be really in the wings in America, already taking place and already shaping up in America. We talked about, first of all, that speech should not be a category needing punishment at all, especially at a federal level, because the Constitution of the United States forbids the federal government from overseeing anything to do with that, according to our own Bill of Rights. Not only so, but the federal government not only forbidden, but the federal government is forbidden from being the watchdog over the states regarding these things. And that's what the Constitution of the United States is all about. But also, something else that we pointed out, and that is, what is hateful to one person is not hateful to another. And what they're really getting at is what they want to do is curtail speech from pulpits, religious speech that is reflective of the Bible, that teaches such things as that sodomy, homosexuality is wrong, transgenderism is sinful. These things, they don't want any talk like that. They don't want any criticism of Islam. We'll say more about that in just a moment. But here's something else, and I said this really coming down the pike for America also. Not only is it already occurring through the Biden administration, totalitarian-minded as he is, via big tech, through Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms, but I want you to think about the United Nations for a moment. the United Nations agrees with the government of Scotland. And therefore, America needs to be aware also, because we've signed on to the United Nations world government. Here's how the UN addresses hate speech and encourages all member countries to pass laws reflective of what the UN tells us regarding hate speech. Listen to this comment. Hate speech on their website says, in common language, hate speech loosely refers to offensive discourse targeting a group or an individual based on inherent characteristics. Now you might say, what is an inherent characteristic? Well, race, religion, gender, or anything that may threaten social peace. Let's just stop there for a moment. What will happen if preachers such as I do criticize Islam and criticize Muhammad as being a false prophet? What is the Muslim community going to do? Well, if I'm in New York, well, they're going to be up in arms. Anything that causes unrest, and they're going to blame the person who's pointing it out. They don't want any plain speaking. They don't want any. The United Nations does not desire any open debate, no discussion. Just if it causes unrest, and some people are ready to be unrestful and just drop the hat, and they'll be unrestful. So that's the United Nations. Furthermore, here's what they say. The UN speaking here from their website. Hate speech is any kind of communication in speech, writing, behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to any identity factor. So if you say something is wrong, something is sinful, something is anti-God, something is atheistic, if you say that Muhammad was a false teacher, if you say Joe Smith was a false teacher, if you say he was a charlatan, if you say Muhammad was a charlatan, all of these things are going to be eliminated. That eliminates open debate. It eliminates freedom of thought. It eliminates anything. Isn't it interesting that Christianity is the only religion? I don't speak about Roman Catholicism either. I'm speaking about New Testament Christianity is the only religion that encourages open discussion and free debate. This is the only religion, Christianity, the Bible. That's why it's allowed in America to openly criticize even Christianity or the Bible. And when people do so, I challenge them to debate. I'm happy to discuss it on a polemic platform. But normally they want a closed audience, such as a school classroom or a collegiate classroom, high school classroom. They want to criticize and attack the Bible, attack Christ. You can't do that in a Muslim country because it's not defensible. Islam is not, and neither is the Quran. Same thing with Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon. So that's the United Nations. Now, of course, these strictures are only to be applied in one direction, against conservatives, against the Christian community. How do we know? Watch, for example, how Mark Zuckerberg explained to the American people that the FBI, remember him speaking before Congress? How the FBI actually engaged in tipping the scales via Facebook and these different social media platforms in favor of the Democrats and Joe Biden. Zuckerberg himself fully supported censoring conservatives at the behest of, at the request of the Democratic-controlled government in Washington, D.C. And Zuckerberg rewarded them with millions of dollars into the coffers. But here's something else interesting that people may not know. The official government in Scotland is guided by one of the officials who crafted this hate speech bill. His name is Humza Yousaf. Yes, he's a Muslim. He served as the first minister of Scotland and leader of the nationalist, or rather the Scottish National Party. Yousaf is a Muslim. And behind this law, do not criticize Islam, do not criticize Muhammad, as in Muslim countries. Can you go to a Muslim country and stand up in a public forum and criticize Muhammad? Not being ugly, not being nasty, not using foul language, just saying he was a charlatan, He was a false teacher. He concocted the story. He concocted out of his own imagination, and his followers did, the Quran. Can you say that? No, you can't say those things. You can't have an open discussion. Now, you can do that regarding Christianity anywhere, and they don't want a Christian to give answer to it, such as I'm always ready to do. But you can't even talk that way regarding Islam. Humza Yousaf, the Scottish Nationalist Party, crafted this bill in Scotland. Do not criticize Islam. Do not criticize Muhammad. And any person familiar with Sharia law knows perfectly well that in Muslim-dominated countries, you cannot criticize the Prophet Muhammad. You cannot call into question his credentials. You cannot call into question whether he was actually spoken to by God, actually whether there is a God that is Allah. If one does so, you take your own life into your hands. Yousaf, however, is heralded by Time magazine as a great trailblazer, a man who shapes the future for America. That's Time magazine, October 2023. You see where the national media wants to go? The mainstream media, Time magazine representing it here. They want to go exactly this way. Don't criticize Islam. What does this portend for preaching the gospel and opposing error here in America? I'll tell you what it portends. It portends, and it shows that we're coming to totalitarianism is what it comes to. Lastly, I want to point out this. The most important right that we exercise in America is freedom of speech. At least that is the way Thomas Jefferson framed it. He said the liberty of speaking and writing guards our other liberties. I heard a person say, no, it's the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, that guards the rest of them, and that may be true to an extent as well. But Jefferson believed that liberty of speaking and writing guards all of our other liberties. It allows people to think freely and to publish freely their thoughts. So deeply was this principle ingrained in citizens of the United States that George Washington, during the War for Independence in 1783, addressed his officers in this fashion. And here's a direct quote from George Washington. For if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter, that is to say, if they're to be stopped from offering their thoughts on a particular issue, which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences that can invite the consideration of mankind, reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we will be led like sheep to the slaughter. That's exactly right. If we don't have freedom of speech, then there's no freedom of thought. And if there is freedom of thought, you've got to muzzle your mouth. You can't say anything because the negative consequences that people are going to have regarding it. The modern writer and podcaster Karen Cataline explains the authoritarianism behind hate speech laws. She worded it so well, and she pointed out if we can't criticize them, that is government officials and news reporters, aren't they guilty of the same authoritarianism of which they have accused Donald Trump? I heard a normally reasonable Fox News reporter, she writes, say that the reason it's inappropriate to criticize the press is because we need them to decipher news for us. There's that arrogance again. We used to need reporters to report the news for us, not to decipher it. So make no mistake, free speech gone in Scotland and really on the edge here in America, gone in Canada. Muzzling critics, whether in college campuses, on the internet, or any form of media, is to identify with Chairman Mao. And that's exactly what J.K. Rowling has pointed out in Scotland. And my hat's off to her on that one.